I think I shared in one of our meetings at some point in the past the story of what I'm about to share with you, but you probably don't remember it anyway. But back about a month before I was to get married to my lovely bride-to-be over here, my bride-to-be took me and a good friend of mine and a canoe and headed south of her hometown a considerable distance and dropped us off at a place called Terrapin Creek. Now, Terrapin Creek was a little creek, and we had the canoe, and we knew that we'd be going down the creek, and there'd be places we'd have to get out, lift up the canoe, get over the rocks, and keep going. Just a little stream like that. But this day, the stream had swollen just a bit, making it absolutely perfect for canoeing. So we get in, she leaves, goes back home. We get in the canoe, and we start down the stream. And not very far, a flash flood happened. It had rained up north, and the water came down behind us and instantly went out over the banks of this creek. It became a ferocious river, as it were, and it lifted us to where we're now caught up in the overhanging trees above it, getting beat and slapped to death with branches and limbs and stuff. Then we went over what was probably a log in the water below that created a whirlpool and sucked the canoe right out from under us. And both of us underwater. Had life jackets on. That's part of the human thing that saved us at the time. But here I was underwater. Danny, I didn't know it, but he caught hold of a tree before he went under behind me. But I couldn't see him. And I was underwater being hit and slapped with all this stuff. And I knew my life was over. But I just did this right here. And there was a limb there I caught hold to, was able to pull myself up so I could breathe while debris still slapping against my body, and pull myself up into the tree. Now, I considered that a miracle of God. It was as though He reached down His hand and lifted me up, much the way what happened in our scripture passage today, where Jesus reached Peter, who was drowning, and pulled him up and took him to the boat. Jesus was walking on the water, and Peter said, "Oh, let me come walk on the water with you." And he said, okay. Peter made it a little way, and then he went down, and Jesus did that. I'll come back to my canoe story later. But our passage today has to do with Scripture sharing that in the midst of many miracles, something more profound than the miracle happened. Now think about that. The miracles that Christ performed, there are things more profound than those miracles. And we want to look at today the process of moving toward that profound conclusion. You'll find the scripture in Matthew chapter 14, verses 19 through 36. I'll read it as we go along and tear it apart a little bit, outline it, and look at it. But here's the point of what I want us to do today. We have to appreciate the miracles while understanding the process to the profound, because it can happen in our lives. So first, in the process, we look at the wow, W-O-W. To have a wow is to see what God is doing and appreciate where it came from and what's going on. That's a wow kind of moment. And in our scripture passage, that wow moment starts with a miracle. Matthew 14:14. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, He had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now, you might remember from last week, we looked at the feeding of the 5,000, which was probably like 15,000, counting women and children there. All that happened with that is over with. And now Jesus wanted to go be alone because his good friend, cousin, and prophet, John the Baptizer, is dead, and they've come and told him that. He just wants to be alone, but he couldn't because people got there ahead of him, and He had compassion on them, verse 14 says, and healed their sick. That's a miracle. Now, He didn't just heal one person. It's one of those, we don't know how many He healed, but He healed whoever was there. Verse 15 says, as evening approached, the disciples came to Him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the village and buy themselves some food. Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. And the disciples said, we got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And so Jesus lifted that, gave thanks for it. Everybody ate till satisfied. and now they had 12 basketfuls left over, and that was 5,000 men plus women and children. That's the miracle that has taken place here. Now, let's look at the magnitude of that miracle. Verse 20 of Matthew 14 says, "They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up the 12 basketfuls left over." As we talked last week, that can be different forms of God doing miracles, just multiplying the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, or opening people's hearts so they shared the food that they had too, or did both of those. Either way, it's a marvelous miracle. 15,000, and they had basketfuls left over. That's the wow of seeing and appreciating something marvelous that God has done. Now, just look around you. You look at nature, especially this morning. This morning would have been an Easter morning when I was a child. This is the temperature of Easter. Every Easter I can remember. It's just absolutely beautiful. Azaleas and all that kind of stuff blooming and all. Just think of that. And it's a wow moment. Or think of a newborn baby, or a little child. We stopped at Dairy Queen in New Smyrna Beach the other day, and it was just the time the Catholic school had gotten out, and there were all these little 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds running around in their little uniforms, getting ice cream. I don't know if they do that every day, but they were doing it that day. And we just stood there and marveled at these little lives that were so happy and so joyous. That's a wow thing, at what God has done. And the universe on a starry night, and knowing what all is out there, a wow thing. Or maybe it's just your answered prayer. You've asked God to intervene in some way, and He does it. That's a wow thing, and we could go on and on. But there's something next in the process. There's the wow that you see, maybe a miracle of God, and then there's the walk, or the work that continues. In our scripture passage, you see it in verse 22 as the immediate. Immediately, Jesus made His disciples get into a boat and go on. Their lives were going on. They were headed somewhere. They had to continue that journey. You can't just stop and appreciate the miracle and not do anything else in life. You can't do that. You remember at the ascension of Jesus, they were standing there looking up, and angels showed up and say, "Guys, what are you doing staring up in the sky here? You've got to go on. This same Jesus is going to come back, but you got to get on with life." So you can't just rest in the miracle and not do anything else. They went on. Now, Andrew, Peter, James, and John worked as fishermen. They got in this boat. The others were familiar with that occupation. So the disciples were assigned to go on about their work, to go to where they were intended to go, while Jesus went on about His work. And that work was a meeting, a conference with God. Verse 23 says, "After Jesus had dismissed them, He went up to a mountainside by Himself to pray, and when evening came, He was there alone." By the way, based on what we're going to find out later, He was there at least 9 hours by Himself, maybe more, but at least 9 hours. Can you think of a prayer time you've ever had, or I've ever had, that lasted anywhere near that? That's the walk. The disciples went on to what they needed to do. Jesus went on to what He needed to do, even after the miracles. So we have the wow and the walk of life. Next in the process is the wind and the worry. Our scripture passage in verse 24 just sort of shows us a menace to the disciples. The boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Now, these disciples often fished at night. That wasn't a problem. They could navigate at night. The wind and the waves were a problem. They were a menace. Now, this is not the only time this has happened. You recall the other time it happened in Matthew 8, Jesus was in the boat asleep with them when they had to call on Him to calm everything down. Well, there's the menace, the wind, the danger for them. Then there's the mirage. They saw a mirage. A mirage, and you've seen movies in the desert, people look up and there's a big lake out there and all this stuff. Well, it's the refraction of the light and all that stuff. It's not really there. Well, they saw something they thought was not really there. Verse 25 says, during the fourth watch, now the fourth watch is from 3 a.m. to 6. 6 to 9, 9 to 12, 12 to 3, 3 to 6. So Jesus was walking somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 o'clock. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. There's their mirage. Here's the message from Jesus in verse 27. Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Now, they had been with Jesus quite a while. You'd think they'd recognize his voice. He said, "Don't be afraid." That's a biblical theme for the child of God all the way through Scripture. Back in Joshua, Joshua said to the people, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, be strong and courageous, because God says, I will be with you." Elisha said to his servant in 2 Kings chapter 6, "Don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And then Jesus himself in the New Testament, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body." Don't be afraid of them. "Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father's been pleased to give you the kingdom. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give it to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." Do not let your hearts be troubled. You're in control of that. Do not be afraid. And then from the book of the Revelation, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one." His message to his disciples was, guys, don't be afraid. I'm here. Do not be afraid. Well, that wasn't good enough. Good old Peter has what I call a make sure. I want to make sure it's you. I want you to prove that it's you. And then he did a dumb thing, because if it hadn't been Christ, he would have drowned on the spot. He said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. Now that making sure led to a mess for Peter when he took his eyes off Jesus. And usually when this passage is taught, that's the main point. Do not take your eyes off Jesus. And that's a good point. Don't get me wrong. But as with any passage of Scripture, there are many facets, and we're looking at this process to the profound is what we want here. But he took his eyes off Jesus. Verse 30 of Matthew 14 says, "When he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. 'You of little faith,' he said, 'why do you doubt?'" The wind and the worry in this process we're talking about. Now, our scripture passage shares that in the midst of these miracles, now what just happened there was another miracle after the other miracle of feeding the 5,000. In the midst of miracles, something more profound than the miracles is taking place. We want to look at that process. And here's the conclusion. Here's what's more important. They worshiped. That's it. They worshiped. We see it in Scripture as the magnification of Jesus. Now, as I told you last week, there were some 18 miracles before the feeding of the 5,000 that are recorded in Scripture. Now, some of those are what I call sets of miracles. He healed everybody they brought to him. That's a set of miracles. We don't know how many. But those had already been done. So about counting the 5,000, there are 19 of them, sets had already been done. Here's what Scripture says in 14:32. "And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down." Another miracle. "Then those who were in the boat worshiped him." There you go. They had seen the miracles. The winds of life caused them to worship him. The midst of the miracles caused something more profound to take place, and that's it. They worship. You see, the miracles were all temporary. All of them were temporary. But here is a change in men's hearts. Probably the most difficult thing God has to deal with, our stubborn hearts. But here these hearts melted, and they worshiped. But notice, the process now begins to repeat itself. And in our lives and their lives, this process will repeat itself over and over and over again. Here's the wow again. A miracle when they crossed over and landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country, and people brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak. Jesus healed them. We don't know how many, but he healed them. Verse 36 says, and here's the magnitude of this miracle again. All who touched him. Remember, 15,000 ate and were satisfied. Wow, they had food left over when they didn't have it to begin with. But here, all who touched him were healed. The wow, the work of life, the winds, all leading us to worship. So what do we learn? What do we apply from this? That process is still alive and active today. The wow is when we see the hand of God. Now, oftentimes to see the hand of God, you've got to be looking for the hand of God. You just look around, pause, be still and know that I am Lord, he says. Just pause and look, and you'll see miracle after miracle after miracle. And it'll be hard to go on in the walk of life because you want to just stop and wow right there all day long, kind of thing. But the walk continues in your life's journey. You're taking care of the daily bread that you need, etc. And then the winds come. Now, I know you, and I know the winds that you've been through and that you're going through, the winds and waves of life. Some of them are physical. Some of them are emotional. Some are financial. Some are relational, and we could go on and on. But in the midst of that, as the disciples did, you can worship. You can worship. I'll not be shaken because the Lord's at my right hand. Are you, am I, participating in that worship? Now, we're going to process through these things, not just one wind in life. There are multiple winds in life, as there are multiple wows in life and a lot of work in life. A lot of worship time in life, too, if we avail ourselves to it. It's going to happen over and over and over again. Well, my canoe story, I left off where I was up a tree, just hanging on with my legs in the water. But in that moment, I was wowed that all I did was stick my arm up and there was a branch big enough for me to grab right there. And God saved my life and Danny's life. But my life had to continue on. I couldn't stay sitting in the branch of a tree over a swollen creek. You can't stay there. It took us 40 minutes to climb through the trees to the other side to finally reach some semi-dry land. In the shadow of the miracle of being saved, we climbed through those trees to the middle of nowhere in a cotton field. We had to walk through all that dirt to a road. Then we had to hitchhike because the love of my life had left us. We hitchhiked back to town. That wasn't the worst part. Had to break the news to the owner of the canoe that his canoe was gone. We never found it. We went back down the creek later and never found the canoe. It was gone. That was quite an experience too. He was a doctor in our church, and Danny didn't want to go, so I got to go by myself and sat down with him and said, Dr. Black, I want to thank you for letting us borrow your canoe. We'd like to buy it from you. To which he responded, oh no, Dave, it means so much to our family. We have so many memories attached to that canoe. I'm just feeling guiltier and guiltier and wishing Danny bad things to happen to him because he wasn't there. I said, well, you have to sell it to us, and I told him the story. So then we had to pay for a canoe. He laughed. He was laughing. But we paid for the canoe. The miracles of God lead us to walk on through life with God in the winds and ultimately worship Him. You look for the time to worship in the midst of your regular walk, and in the winds. I want us to be encouraged today as a child of God that this process exists for us, as a church of God that this process exists for us, and simply as a worshiper to be reminded to look for the while, to continue the walk, to know the winds are coming, but worship. Truly, you are the Son of God, they said.